Okay, well, I'm going to take up where you just left off. Dealt with in what manner? These horrible instances that have been outlined. Tell us.
Teachers need to be fired.
Okay. I want to go back to something that is actually beyond the scope of your testimony, Mr. Lincoln, and I apologize in advance for that, but my colleague, Ms. Manning, raised it in her, I think it was Ms. Manning, raised it in her opening remarks, and it's one that I think, thank you, by the way, for your 15 years on the ground and for the time that you spent in Gaza and the West Bank and the work that you've done. I think that that gives you a firsthand view, that it makes you a very knowledgeable witness, and we can benefit from that. But my question is, why are there still refugee camps in Gaza?
As I mentioned in my testimony, and it's a bit strange to say, but the easiest way to get rid of UNRWA and consign it to history is, of course, in the context of a negotiated two-state solution. This was certainly what the framers of the Oslo process, perhaps naively, perhaps wishfully thought when they formed this process around 30 years ago. But ultimately, it has the status of refugees has always been considered one of the final status issues related to the peace process between Israel and the Palestinians. In terms of the existence of refugee camps on the ground in places like West Bank and Gaza, it's, of course, these refugee camps are actually have the appearance more of neighborhoods or towns than anything else. They've been there on the ground, as mentioned, for some 74, 75 years. But in terms of the, it's more an issue of the status of these people pending a political resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. This is, for better or for worse, the mandate that UNRWA has been given by the United Nations.
Okay, I understand that's your view. The idea that the refugees of 1948 and 1949 are continuing to be served by UNRWA, I think, is, preposterous. And so what we're talking about is successive generations of people who are essentially born into refugee status? Is that what we're talking about?
Yes, you're.
Okay. And you said that 70% of the population of Gaza is provided services by UNRWA.
Around 1.5 million beneficiaries in Gaza.
So, you also made reference in answer to my question about why there are still refugee camps, which you described as neighborhoods. Fair enough, but they're neighborhoods consisting of people who are registered refugees. Yes.
Correct.
And you described it as being part of the final political process of creating peace in the Middle East, which who knows whether that will ever come. And I'm not here to argue with you by any means. You are here as our witness, but I want you to shed some light on why it is that Israel, which was willing to accept this two-state solution, is now suffering from the effects of the anti-Semitism that even you acknowledge exists in the UN and in UNRWA. And I'm just going to leave that there. You don't need to actually answer that. That's more of a rhetorical question. But I am deeply concerned about the anti-Semitism that we see in the UN and UN agencies. You speak glowingly, and I would agree with you, on the role of former UN Secretary General Kofi Annan and his fight against anti-Semitism. You quoted his statement, which I thought was a beautiful one. But what I'd like to know from you, since you've obviously studied the UN and you've studied Secretary General Annan's shepherding of it, what can be done to eliminate that anti-Semitism as he called for so many years ago?
Thank you for the question.
The softball question.
Sure, no, absolutely. Leadership.
Not really.
Leadership matters in any organization. It matters at the United Nations as well. And Kofi Annan's words, although they were written some time ago, echoed very strongly throughout the system, and also set an example for the member states and for the member state bodies. It will never, the sort of dichotomy between the United Nations as both the stage and the member state bodies and the actor is one that the stage, unfortunately, is a reflection of the world and a reflection of at least opinions of states. So when we talk about these entities, for example, special rapporteurs, Human Rights Council, as Hillel and others have very, rightly and very strongly brought up some of the deep concerns about how they function. Again, when we say that these are, UN opinions, UN thoughts, or somehow UN resolutions, it's important to understand where they come from. And the leadership that was demonstrated by not just Kofi Annan, but other Secretary Generals in this regard, and Kofi Annan, of course, had no problem calling this out in a very similar way that we heard from the colleagues here today. And he lamented it not only for the anti-Semitism and for the concern that it is, but also that it brought us no closer to peace, and it ultimately did nothing for the Palestinians and their search for self-determination as well.
When is the last time the United Nations had a Secretary General who called out anti-Semitism? No, I'm not
Are you asking me?
Yeah, I'm not trying to give you a trick question. I'm just curious.
Antonio Gutierrez has made some statements to that effect. I think, definitely speaking, definitely from a historical perspective, Kofi Annan sets the standard, and then, of course, it was continued by his successor, Ban Ki-moon. You have seen similar statements, especially during visits of the current Secretary General to Israel, in which he was, of course, hosted by Prime Minister Netanyahu. I was on the ground supporting that trip, where he made some, very clear statements. I don't have them at hand. So you do hear this, but again, I think that the standard and the ability to relate it specifically to the ongoing conflict and to separate some of these issues out was definitely set by Secretary General Kofi Annan.
I'm going to ask one other area, and then I'll pass to my colleagues, but I may come back and ask some more. Obviously, your position is that we need to work to reform and improve UNRWA, not abolish it. I'd be interested to know if you have any specific thoughts about what we do to improve and reform it. I'll just end there.
Sure. I think that the best place to start with regard to UNRWA is to sort of understand that it's this creation of the General Assembly, and it's to me, the root of a number of these flaws are that it falls between the cracks with regard to accountability in general, and this is what we heard from some of the other colleagues as well. I do see the Secretariat, the Secretary General in particular, being able to take on more of a role. There's also the, and I'm sure the colleagues would have a lot to say about it, but within the Department of Peace Building and Political Affairs, there is also the Division of Palestinian Rights within. And again, with a view to clarifying accountability frameworks. Who's in charge? Who is in charge of UNRWA? And then also with a goal to try and sharpen its humanitarian and development roles on the ground, I think would go a long way to addressing a number of the key shortcomings of the agency, including some of the issues that the colleagues raised, very real and serious issues that the colleagues raised today. In my opinion, this cannot be done bilaterally. The United States has tried both ways, either as the biggest donor to exercise the leverage in that respect, or to defund. Neither will work. It's a multilateral entity. This is the United Nations. We need to work with allies, and there is a lot of common ground. But if we do it just solely based on one particular issue or one particular set of issues, then it will likely be less successful, is my view.
Sorry, I said that was my last. I have one last. So with your focus on improving the actual humanitarian rebuilding efforts on the ground in Gaza, my question to you is, how does that get done with Hamas present?
Two sets of issues. One is I can tell you from my experience how we did it after the 2014 war. And you're hearing...
You think it's applicable now? Sure.
Yeah, because you're hearing a lot of the same things. And again, we don't know how this particular conflict is going to end. We don't know. And what will be on the ground.
Let's even talk about prior to October 7th, okay?
Okay.
So before this conflict started, UNRWA was on the ground, but not providing the focus level of humanitarian support that you think is optimal, right? And I guess my question is, so how is that supposed, let's talk about before October 7th.
It is largely because of Hamas and because of Hamas's presence that UNRWA is actually strengthened on the ground. Because a lot of donors would prefer to give to a UN agency that has some degree of accountability, rather than working with ministries that some have closer ties with Hamas than others. The problem has always been that, and we saw this, and it's applicable to the current context and as a lesson learned for the future. After 2014, you saw a reinvigorated sense from the Palestinian Authority that they were going to play a role in the reconstruction on the ground. This was what the Gaza reconstruction mechanism was all about, and this was what the political efforts were. Because of Hamas's existence, continued existence on the ground, and because of its own internal divisions and its own political problems within the Palestinian body politic, between the Palestinian Authority and the Hamas de facto government in Gaza, it broke down. And the engagement of the Palestinian Authority wavered over time because they felt that it was working too much to support, not to support necessarily, but to take Hamas, the Hamas government, off the hook with regard to governance.
I'll stop you there. Mr. Schanzer, you wanted to
Yeah, look, I want to just point out something, and it should be obvious, but maybe it isn't. UNRWA helped perpetuate Hamas rule, starting in 2007 when Hamas took over the Gaza Strip by force in a brutal civil war in which they toppled the Palestinian Authority. Hamas has been the sovereign basically for 16 years. It failed to provide basic services to its own people because, surprise, terrorist groups don't care about providing basic services.
Mr. Lincoln, do you disagree with what he just said? Sorry.
It's not just UNRWA.
What he just specifically said. Do you disagree with that?
That terrorist groups are not interested.
No, before that.
That UNRWA helped perpetuate Hamas rule.
I don't think that that's completely accurate. I think it's far more nuanced.
Okay. I'm going to yield to my colleague.